Good evening. Welcome so much. My name is Matt Bell. I'm the director of the World Building Initiative here at ASU. My pleasure to welcome you to our third workshop of the spring semester, Speculative Histories, Lost Archives, and Alternative Realities. Tonight we'll have presentations from members of our ASU Humanities community, after which we'll have time for conversations and for questions, whether you're with us here in person or joining us online. Before we begin, just want to quickly thank our partners at ASU, including the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, the Department of English, the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing, and the Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics, where the World Building Initiative is housed. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's world builders, Elizabeth Grumbach and Ahmad Jabini. Elizabeth Grumbach is the Director of Digital Humanities and Research at Arizona State University's Lincoln Center for Applied Ethics. She currently serves as the co-vice president, co-president-elect of the Association for the Computers and the Humanities. For the Computers and the Humanities?
Close enough.
Yep. I'm just reading.
Thank you.
Her current research focuses on design, justice, and critical tech interventions that incorporate care practices and community-driven research. She currently directs the Digital Reparative Archives Working Group at ASU. Her most recent published work can be found in Digital Humanities Quarterly, the Journal for Electronic Publishing, and the Journal on Computing and Cultural Heritage, as well as the Routledge Companion to Libraries, Archives, and the Digital Humanities. Ahmad Jabini is an Iranian-American writer and educator based in Phoenix, Arizona. He earned his MA in Literacy and Cultural Studies from the University of Utah and is currently an MFA candidate in fiction at the Arizona State University. He also defended his MFA thesis yesterday, so he's now currently a Master of Fine Art. His work has appeared in Brevity, the Texas Review, and the Goliath Review, among others. He has received support from the Vermont Studio Center, the Kenyon Review, the Center for Imagination of the Borderlands, and the Virginia G. Piper Center for Creative Writing. He is the current nonfiction editor for Hayden's Fair Review. Please join me in welcoming Liz Grumbach.
Thank you so much, Matt. I can't tell you what a pleasure it is to be speaking at a world building event instead of just chilling at the back watching all the world building conversations happening. So thank you for
very lucky
here in the space, and I have such an amazing conversation today, so I'm so excited. So hi, I'm Liz Grumbach. I am going to be thinking with you all today about reparative digital archives for a broken world. People are taking photos, so I'm going to pause. Because the next slide is a bummer. The next slide is, well, I'll tell you about it in a moment, but first of all, so there was an executive order earlier this year that first put almost all of the staff at the Institute of Museum and Library Sciences on administrative leave, and then later allowed for the termination of almost all grants to museums, libraries, and higher education institutions. Last week, the IMLS Instagram account posted a graphic about the savings that cutting the IMLS would have and the kinds of programs that were cut. In a way, bragging about how those grants that served historically underrepresented and marginalized communities would now be cut. The impacts of this defunding, the impacts of deprioritizing, telling stories, putting new stories into our historical record, the impact of this is going to be immeasurable. It's going to have direct impact on the stories that we're able to tell, the materials that we're able to preserve. And I'm seeing this as a real massive wave that is coming from the present, sweeping into the past and going into the future. The aftermath of this wave is going to be deeply felt in all of our communities. And we're seeing the impacts of that wave now. We're already feeling the aftermath. As we see erasures happening, such as the erasure of trans from the Stonewall National Monument website, we're feeling the wave. If anyone knows anything about Stonewall, you know that this in particular is incredibly egregious. Or examples like the temporary, which has now been restored after public outcry, the temporary erasure of Harriet Tubman and references to enslaved peoples from the National Park Service's educational resources on the Underground Railroad. So the right here is the original, and the left is a scrubbed version of the website that centers Black-white cooperation in place of the previous historical context. So, what strategies do we have to continue to preserve and collect these stories in the aftermath of this wave? I'm going to invoke here Steve Jackson's work at the beginning of this conversation, his work in Rethinking Repair on Repair, in which he's describing, in this quote in particular, I'm not going to read the whole thing, two worlds that are existing side by side. One that is always almost falling apart, the always almost falling apart world, and the other world that is constantly reinventing itself, and says that the fulcrum of these two worlds is repair. Steve Jackson then goes on to have a really interesting conversation with us about how this connects to acts of care. If we devote time to think about what happens when the cracks appear, when the fractures happen, then we can think about how those fractures impact the survival of the past and the present, and we can create strategies to repair the world. So these strategies rely on mutual care and responsibility. It invokes things like technology ethics and archival ethics, which I might talk about a little bit later, and a feminist ethics of care. And by doing that, we're extending these strategies that Steve talks about into archives, into the stories that we want to tell, to care for the stories and the materials that we want to be the stewards of. So in an always almost falling apart world, reparative archives are an always already action. Reparative archiving is not a static goal. Archiving is not a static goal. It's not something that you set and once you have everything in the archive, you're done with the archive. It's not something to be achieved and then set aside. Reparative archiving, and I'm going to invoke some D&D for my nerds in the room. Reparative archiving is a readied action. It's something that you prepare. And then I have this quote up here because I think it's incredibly important right now. Let's make sure I have the whole thing highlighted, as you can see this on the slides. This was Howard Zinn in the 70s. He first gave this talk before he published it to a group of historians and archivists that almost booed him out of the room. And I'm putting this on here to say archivists are rebels. Digital archives are rebellious. Maybe more accurately, if I'm invoking Zinn and what he's saying here, they have the potential to be rebellious, and that's incredibly important right now. I also want to say archives are not, nor have they ever been neutral. That's a myth that some people believe about archives. And so we should not, in this moment or ever, presume to proceed in this work with neutrality. And now I'm going to shift just a little bit. So the archive is not neutral, but what are all of the ways in which the archive is not neutral? So Michelle Caswell says in Urgent Archives that dominant Western archival theories are oppressive by design. And I would say that this is especially true for some of the digital archival platforms that we have, that we use in libraries and that digital humanists sometimes use to create digital archives. Caswell and other folks that write on this say that the archive can be a site of assimilation, that it's a method of organizing memory, of organizing stories into hierarchical, searchable, sometimes exclusionary containers. It, in some ways, is a distancing tactic. Using these kinds of archival theories to do archival work is severing us from memory. It's severing our physical bodies that are the lived memory of the past. I'm going to talk about ancestor thinking in just a moment. So to get around this, we can ask questions like, who are we preserving for? How are we defining preservation? Are we defining preservation from a Western perspective, an Eastern perspective, an Indigenous perspective? Can we incorporate all of those into the same space, or are we defining it from a techno-futurist perspective, which is new? Well, it's not new, it's a very old story, but are we thinking about, designing archives and digitizing things and putting them online so that they can be ingested into large language models, which is another kind of archival theory. So speaking of oppressive by design, the Library of Congress subject headings, which some of you may be familiar with, are one of the core metadata vocabularies that are used as a standard in almost every cultural heritage institution to describe materials, holdings, and digitized objects. Within these subject headings are occasionally outdated, sometimes harmful, sometimes offensive language that are used to describe materials from a Western perspective. So I won't repeat any of those things, but I think we can imagine how these vocabularies that were originally written in 1898 might describe cultures in harmful ways. So elsewhere, I've actually written about these things as wounds in the metadata, as descriptive words that hurt communities across time and space. But what do reparative strategies for metadata look like? One example is a project called the Homosaurus, which is an international LGBTQIA+ linked data vocabulary. So the Homosaurus, this vocabulary sits on top of and maps onto the Library of Congress and expands it. And the way that they've done this is that they've researched and talked to the communities that are the stewards of these materials and had them tell the Homosaurus team how they wanted those materials described. It's super powerful. So some of the examples of terms that do not exist in the Library of Congress but do exist in the Homosaurus are coming out story, AIDS awareness, adopted parenthood, two-spirit identity, my favorite, queer joy, and pink triangles. And those are just some of them. I'm going to skip over this for time's sake, but I wanted to show it up here just to say that something else that's incredibly important for folks to discuss is silences in the archive. So gaps, intentional erasures or accidental erasures, forgotten voices, and propose that a way that we can solve some of those archival silences is here by planning archives from a community-driven perspective. And just very quickly, I will put two examples of that up here. Post-custodial archiving is a community-driven model for archives. It's a practice where communities maintain control over basically every part of the archive, and archivists and scholars are there to provide maintenance, training, support, etc. There are two examples here. The first over here is an archive that was founded by a lot of people, but including my amazing colleague in the DH Reparative Archives Working Group, Christina Boyles, on the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico and what it looks like for Puerto Rico in crisis. And then over here is the Sutro project, which is saving Ukrainian cultural heritage online. So it is a group of folks, international group of folks, that years ago now, which is painful to think about, started saving things from the Ukrainian internet and from cultural heritage institutions before they were destroyed, before the servers were wiped or destroyed, before the cultural heritage institutions themselves, the buildings were destroyed. Happy to talk about that more in the future because it's an amazing project and it is truly community driven in an international way. And now here's where I might bring up speculative futures, which is very exciting. This is a list of tenets of digital reparative archives as collected and decided on over the past several years of our work in the Lincoln Center. And the two most important things are up at the top. Well, the two most important things to me, I should say. The first is archives are storytelling, not storage, not just storage. And then to recall from earlier, reparative archives are not static, right? They are ready actions. We prepare in advance to take an action later. We tell those stories, and then perhaps we store them. I also, I'll point this out really quickly. So archives are ancestor technologies and ancestral thinking as well. They allow us to think and talk across time and space. And now I'm going to invoke fairly quickly Sadia Hartman's theory of critical fabulation. Hartman employs critical fabulation to recall and retell these never created but much longed for records of history. These stories and accounts of marginalized and forgotten peoples and voices, particularly in Hartman's work, enslaved persons. Hartman's work is both reparative and speculative. It allows us a method of thinking as and with our ancestors to create stories for those that come after us. So I'm going to say something that I forgot to say at the beginning of this slide, which is reparative digital archives are speculative archives. They are assertions of what we wish to be as humans, how we wish to be remembered, and how we wish to remember. I'm not going to have much time to talk about this, but I will say that I have and will be practicing reparative and speculative archival methods in the near future with some of my colleagues who are in this room in the wake of federal funding termination. As of last week, we received a termination notice for the project that we have been working on in the archive that we have been building in community with online content creators to contain, collect, and emphasize multiple ways of knowing about algorithmic governance. So in the future, I think my challenge will be to use speculation, to use critical fabulation, to use practices of repair to find ways to tell and document and preserve these stories, or perhaps to find ways to rebel against what Howard Zinn calls the politics of the going order. So instead move toward an ethic of care for the future, and for us here. And I will actually just leave this up here and say storytelling is a fight for the future, and I think we're all in that fight now. Thank you so much.
The next slide will have your name on it. You'll be like, oh, that's why.
I was selfish.
Just gonna working with two computers here.
Now that you're a master, you know.
Okay. That's me. All right, it's wonderful to be here. Hello, everyone in this room and digitally, wherever you are. Yeah, so my name is Ahmad Jabini. It's kind of difficult to follow Liz. That was a really wonderful presentation, but I'll just give it my best go. I must apologize in advance for the bare bones nature of my PowerPoint. My original one got wiped this morning, so I kind of had to scramble to put another one together. But the primary focus of my talk is going to be speculative nonfiction and ways in which creative writers can engage with the cracks inherent to the archive. I'll first start off just by briefly discussing my own research and the types of work that I've been doing that has taken me to several different archives across the country. And then we will look a little bit at the theory behind speculative nonfiction. I'll be talking about Saidiya Hartman as well. And then I'm going to look at a few examples from authors who have kind of helped pioneer this emerging genre. So just a little bit of background. Over the last couple of years, I've been working on two projects specifically that have taken me to several archives across the United States. The first was, as I called it, Erstwhile Martyrs and the Legacy of the Iran-Iraq War. I was particularly trying to focus on people who were sent to the front by the Iranian government with every intention of being killed, of being essentially cannon fodder to go out into minefields and set off mines that had been planted by Saddam Hussein's army. And so Erstwhile Martyrs are my effort to connect with the people who came out of that situation alive, one of whom is my father. And then the second one is tentatively titled Asylum Lost Perspectives on Middle Eastern Displacement. And this took me to an archive last summer. Part of the goal was to look at Middle Eastern asylum seekers who have come to the United States in two waves during the first half of the 20th century. And so some of the archival work, or some of the archival documents that I was dealing with regard to the first one, governmental documents from the United States, from Iraq, scholarly articles and reportage, and then direct interviews with some of the erstwhile martyrs. And then with regard to asylum lost, dealing with governmental and immigration records, and then oral histories as well, though those were pretty scant. So with regard to the oral histories in particular, not only were they scant and incomplete, but they were limited a lot to photographs and quantitative information. So as in how many people came, none of which all of which lacks a certain degree of depth to it as far as capturing individual experience. Especially also considering that our definition, or the government's definition of what constitutes a refugee, has changed greatly since the beginning of the 20th century. Obviously, both of these projects are personal to me. By way of anecdote, just to kind of talk about two of my archival experiences with regard to this first project. I was recently at the Beneke Center at Yale University, and I was eager to kind of take a look at the papers of Cyrus Vance, who was the Secretary of State under the Carter administration. A good portion of the documents were restricted, though I was able to access some of the boxes, including those that touched specifically on US policy toward Iran, leading up to the 1979 revolution. I was very excited to look through these boxes, and when I got the first one, I opened it up, and much to my surprise and chagrin, what was in the box was not state documents, but note cards summarizing what the state documents contained, without attribution as to who did the summarization. So part of the difficulty of working with governmental records, apart from the fact that a lot of them can simply just be quantitative and just providing kind of statistics as opposed to actual lived experiences, is that a lot of the time information is redacted without explanation. A lot of the times, particularly with government documents, things are expunged from the record that prevent us from developing an accurate picture of what people were experiencing. If you recall from your composition classes, summaries highlight the important, vital information, which is always at the discretion of the author and usually in service to a particular thesis. As I have learned, the archive is but a narrative. Many of the documents housed within its walls are snippets of narration from what hegemonic forces have deemed to be history's protagonists. It is perhaps no coincidence then that the word archive shares the same Greek root as the word monarchy. Part of the issue that I ran into, or that I noticed while doing archival work, is one of access. 2 summers ago, I was at the Hoover Institution Archives at Stanford University, who, after the 2003 invasion of Iraq by US forces, the US government seized a lot of Ba'athist Party records, a lot of them which ended up making their way to the Hoover Archives at Stanford. Those party records are only accessible at Hoover. They are restricted to everyone who does not sign a particular waiver, and that waiver states that you cannot reproduce, take photos of, copy in any way the documents, and there are hundreds of thousands of documents. You can only stay in the archive and take notes, and that is all that you can do. And so part of the issue with the archive, especially in this case, is that unless you have the means with which to go to Palo Alto, you cannot get access to those records. Apart from limiting scholarship, what we have also done is we have removed those records from access by the Iraqi, and have limited their ability to take a look at parts of their own history and brought that over to the United States. Similar to the way that museums often take cultural artifacts and bring them to the US as well. So I do also want to begin with Saidiya Hartman, specifically her essay, Venus in Two Acts. All forms of nonfiction rely to varying degrees on speculation. Be it a memoir, an essay collection, a biography, or a historical account, writing the past is an interpretive act. To quote Carmen Maria Machado, how people decide who is or is not an unreliable narrator is of curiosity. And after that decision has been made, what do we do with people who attempt to construct their own vision of justice? Speculative nonfiction is an attempt to look through the confines of the archive and toward a more dialogic relationship between past and present. So in my opinion, the progenitor of this genre is Saidiya Hartman. In her essay, Venus in Two Acts, Hartman recounts the difficulties of researching and crafting her book, Lose Your Mother, and a complete absence of texts about the experience of African women on the Middle Passage. Hartman writes, narrative may be the only available form of redress for the monumental crime that was the transatlantic slave trade and the terror of enslavement and racism. The stories we tell, or the songs we sing, or the wealth of immaterial resources are all that we can count on. It would not be far-fetched to consider stories as a form of compensation or even as reparations, perhaps the only kind we will ever receive. So as Liz mentioned, in her essay, Hartman introduces the concept of critical fabulation. In narrative theory, the fabula is defined as a series of logically and chronologically related events, whereas a story is the way in which those related events are organized and structured by the author. So for Hartman, critical fabulation involves representing the sequence of events in divergent stories and from contested points of view in order to jeopardize the status of the event, to displace the received or authorized account, and to imagine what might have happened or what might have been said or might have been done. So of course the difficulty here lies in the reality that when writing about subjects whose unique identities and experiences have been expunged from the cultural and historical record, we are still engaging with them in the manner of their erasure, informed by what has been chosen from preservation. To look beyond the archives, also to be informed by it, to be looking through it as well. But inherent to this creative exercise is also an entanglement with credibility. In conducting interviews with martyrs of the Iran-Iraq War, I chose to privilege their perspective because my project necessitated capturing the whole of their accounts, even if they were not entirely verifiable within the repository of institutional and governmental. In that sense, the issue with that particular war is that there's very little written about it, whether in Iran, Iraq, or the United States. And Iran, and for a great period of time, Iraq, the state wanted to control the narratives that came out about the war in order to mythologize the concept of martyrdom in an effort to continue to fuel their version of the military-industrial complex. And so part of resisting that authoritarian account is to take the narratives of the people who survived that war and tell them exactly as they are, or as close as we can, even if we might not be able to find corroborating information in other texts. But we can think of speculative nonfiction as not only an attempt at counter-history, but also as an aesthetic renegotiation, one which questions the archive and the way in which we recount stories and events and disseminate a system of knowledge. So how best to go about this from a craft perspective? How can we think of critical fabulation on the page? I want to focus on a couple of different craft elements, and then, depending on how much time we have, look at one or two examples. So craft considerations, kind of both looking at other authors who do this type of, who work in this type of genre, and in my own experience. The craft considerations that I think to be most fundamental fall into sort of three camps. The first is narration and narrative distance, and inherent within that is point of view and authorial positionality. Tropes and genres, and temporality and ekphrasis. So how best do we honor cultural and historical silence, especially if it has been willed onto other people? Often in academic works that are published in scholarly journals, the authorial voice is rooted in dispassion. The lack of emotion and removal of the author is intended to communicate the objectivity of the text to the reader, relayed to them by an observer removed from the event of which they are analyzing or describing. Point of view is the way we as writers structure our interpretation. Now, working on the essays about martyrdom in the Iran-Iraq War, that was a deeply personal exercise for me because of its impact on my own family. And so one thing that I wanted to work on specifically was not to take myself out of the narrative in that regard. I wanted to write alongside these individuals because part of the question or the quest of speculative nonfiction has been to understand the way in which the past and the lives of the people forgotten are structuring our present. And so part of my choice with narration was to negotiate how the event was still impacting us in the present and the ways in which I was having to deal with that in my conversations with these individuals. But not everyone always uses the first person. Sometimes in certain works, there is a blending of the first and the second person. I want to take a look at this essay by Roger Reeves, Through the Smoke, Through the Veil, Through the Wind. This is from his essay collection, Dark Days, where he, in this one specifically, he visits the McLeod plantation. And at one point he writes, since hearing of their flight, their journey out of slavery through the pines and stinging insects into the marshes and wetlands, I imagined or tried to at least imagine what that flight must have felt like. Moving off a plantation that you possibly had never left before, moving off a plantation that you possibly had never left before, walking toward the Atlantic and coming upon that big body of water. If you hadn't crossed it before, surely you had heard of it, maybe learned of it, learned of this torturous trip across this abyss. Or maybe you hadn't. To see out onto the water, out onto its largeness, must have felt like an apocalypse and simultaneously an act of redemption. In this essay, Reeves is trying to fill in the gaps of narratives about slaves that escaped the plantation. What did they go through? What did they feel the moment that they had left the plantation? It's a wonderful essay. I would highly recommend it. But the use of the second person here is particularly interesting because the second person is thought of to help minimize narrative distance, to also bring the reader into this world, to get them to experience, as Reeves is experiencing or thinking about on the plantation, the travails that a runaway slave may have faced. But at the same time, the second person here is being used in a dialogue. It is an address of the dead. It is Reeves talking to the individuals who have departed and then been forgotten. I'm going to look at another instance of second person as well in my next example, but keep getting confused as the computer holds the key.
It's because you have identical laptops. You have
Now, one of the issues that I also ran with when writing war stories or writing about individuals in particular, there is always potentially, and Hartman also touches on this in her own work, there is potentially the issue of romanticizing, of turning somebody into an object, even though you are trying to take them out of the context in which they have already been object. And what is important to remember here is that the point of speculative nonfiction is not meant to fully bridge or plug a gap, but in the imagining, we highlight the existence of a gap, which often goes unrecognized by the archive. Now, temporality is important here as well. To quote Hartman again, by flattening the levels of narrative discourse and confusing narrator and speakers, I hope to illuminate the contested character of history, narrative, event, and fact. To question our now as it is interrupted by this past, and to imagine a free state, not as the time before captivity or slavery, but rather as the anticipated future of this right. The past that is forgotten is forgotten. We cannot go back and fully construct with 100% degree of truth what happened. We can only write around what we already have. And we have And we know what we already have is reductive. But part of the goal of speculative nonfiction is not to necessarily reconstruct the past or to lend a lost voice, but to try to understand the echoes and vibrations of the past in the present by writing beyond or in addition to what already exists in the archive as a way of repairing in the future. And so a lot of the speculative nonfiction that I have seen breaks linear.
Yes,
Yeah,
good,
okay,
yeah.
all right. It recombines. It provides openings to imagine, to consider how the world might be otherwise. It is not rooted in the understanding of history as a straight line. It moves back and forth to try to understand the relationships between these different elements as a way of creating a whole picture, or no, let me take that back, as a way of creating a picture beyond what the archive has provided us, but one that will always be lacking in a particular type of texture. Okay. Now, as I'm talking about images, that also brings me to the concept of ekphrasis. So ekphrasis is descriptive speech which brings the subject shown before the eye with visual vividness. The archive, a lot of the times, at least in the research that I have done, is limited to that quantification, to those numbers, and to accounts rooted in colonialism, disruption, imperialism. So a critical reading of what already exists on the record requires a form of slow accumulation. Sometimes, and I encountered this while working on trying to do speculative nonfiction on the accounts of for Middle Eastern refugees who came to the United States in the early 1900s. Sometimes all you have are snippets of information or particular numbers. From there, you can begin a process of trying to paint an image that is rooted in one point in time, not one that moves across, but simply trying to take, for example, a set of numbers about people landing at Ellis Island, and from there try to build a larger image of what they may have experienced based on what you already understand about the conditions of the time. And the last one, tropes and genres. So part of the question here is, as I said, kind of speculative nonfiction is both a question of historiography, but it's also a question of aesthetics. Do we want to use the same types of tropes and genres to tell stories that have been forgotten? Are those tropes and genres capable of capturing stories when they are in the same system of knowledge that descends from the archive? And this brings me to kind of the last example, which is the speculative memoir In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. I want to quote Carmen Maria Machado here when she says, awful and dehumanizing, in regard to tropes, awful and dehumanizing and yet straight out of central casting, this triteness, this predictability has a flattening effect, making singularity boring what is in fact a defining and terrible experience. Tropes and genres, for the reader or the viewer, there is sort of an expectation. You know what may be coming. And to use that to capture narratives and stories that have been lost is to not come up with something that is singular, but to fall within the same system of communicating experience. Let's look at, so if you haven't read In the Dream House, in classic kind of Carmen Maria Machado fashion, it's very experimental. Each page begins with the title Dream House As. And what happens throughout the entire memoir is that Machado uses a lot of different literary tropes. So this one that I picked here is Dream House as Haunted Mansion. There's also Dream House as Bildungsroman. There's Dream House as Chekhov's gun, so forth. So read this in. So in this way, the dream house was a haunted house. You were the sudden, inadvertent occupant of a place where bad things had happened. And then it occurs to you one day, standing in the living room, that you are this house's ghost. You're the one wandering from room to room with no purpose, gaping at the moving boxes that are never unpacked, never certain what you're supposed to do. But in the pursuit, so this is also another example of the second person. In this case, though, Machado is not addressing anyone else. She is addressing a younger version of herself. The majority of the bulk of the memoir deals with a relationship that Machado had while in the MFA program at Iowa that ended up becoming incredibly abusive emotionally and physically. And so part of the second person here is both a way of the present Machado distancing herself, but at the same time directly addressing a younger version of herself. Speculative nonfiction can also be applied to memoir, to use the tools of critical fabulation to understand more about ourselves, especially when our memories of the past have been affected or distorted by the trauma that we experienced in that past. I don't have a quote for it, but in another Hartman book, Wayward Lives, one way that she manipulates tropes is by taking the device of the chorus from Greek plays. Chorus typically is an omniscient ensemble that kept the narration of the play going. In Wayward Lives, Hartman uses the chorus both as a collective voice and as an individual voice that has been rendered anonymous. She uses the trope of the chorus in a way of to combat the way in which the archive has completely expunged the voices of enslaved African women. I think I'm almost out of time, so I'm going to share one more quote from Hartman, which it's not sad, but she ends the essay Venus in Two Acts by saying, "The task of writing the impossible has as its prerequisites the embrace of likely failure and the readiness to accept the ongoing, unfinished, and provisional character of this effort. We too emerge from the encounter with a sense of incompleteness and with the recognition that some part of the self is missing as a consequence of this engagement." So I just talked about all these different things that you can do on the page, focusing on a particular image, trying to subvert tropes and genres to better serve you, and then ending by saying it's probably going to fail. It is probably going to fail because recreating a past that not only has been forgotten, but has been maliciously distorted or buried in order to advance a particular type of narrative is difficult to do. But again, the point of speculative nonfiction is not to completely bridge a gap. It is to point out the existence of one in a new imagination. And so while we can recognize that it is probably impossible and it might lead to failure, which doesn't bode well for my research projects, what it can allow us to do is renegotiate the potential of our future by understanding the way in which our present is being impacted by the memories that we have been forced to forget. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you both so much. Give you guys another round of applause before we start talking. Madhu, you were talking about the impossibility of I think not only speculative fiction, but also archives as well, as very possible tasks. I always think of Kurt Vonnegut in the 60s wrote an essay where he talked about like all the successful things are done, they have been done, and now all we can do is do like spectacular failures. And like, yes, it seems fine. I barely even know where to start. There's so many interesting things. I'll just say for those of you who are here, and then also those of you online, if you want me to give your questions, we'll move to you pretty quickly. And Eric, is it easier if people ask questions in the Q&A thing or just in the chat?
Either or.
All right, either or, Q&A or in the chat. You put them there, we'll get them in the room. I have a bunch of things in sort of.
It's bouncing like right off the hardwood.
It was legit.
Oh, you got the sunbeam.
Yeah.
Yeah. I actually find the sitting on stage part of talking like the hardest part of public speaking. So I guess one thing that I think you both were sort of talking about that I really was drawn to was Liz was talking about how present archival erasure sort of reach into the past and then also extend into the future, right? That erasure sort of has future effects as well. And Ahmad was talking about how that one of the purposes of speculative nonfiction might be to explore and to make visible the lives of those forgotten that are sort of structuring the present and then also sort of going into the past. And I guess one of the things I'm sort of interested in is in what we're talking about is of course the ways where that erasure is sort of purposeful, but also a lot of it of course is accidental as well, right? Records are sort of lost, libraries burn, things happen. And of course like individual lives are often not documented, right? In a sort of a biographical way. And I think one of the things I'm sort of curious about as myself being only a non-important historical individual is like what role do individuals have both in like preserving and shaping like their sort of own stories for future sort of art for future, and then also how can we be like good citizens toward the sort of archives that exist around us? Two very easy, simple things for us to do.
Amazing, thank you. You should join our digital reparative archives working group, I think.
Yeah, good.
Yeah.
I'd love to. Honestly, I think this is not like sort of my area of work exactly, but I find it fascinating. And we can talk more about it, but I think like I always want to hear more about this. Yeah.
I said that like I was going to start, but you totally
Yeah.
should.
No,
Sorry about
please.
that. Okay, all right.
Don't erase yourselves from the present.
Yeah. So as we were talking, there are so many things that I just wrote down that I wanted to respond to. But I think, what roles do we have as individuals, I think is incredibly important. It's a question that I'm asking myself on a daily basis. And I was actually asking myself in a event that I led as a private citizen, not as an employee of a state university this morning, that was an advocacy event calling IML, like our representatives by IMLS and NIH, right? So like what role do we as individuals have in shaping these stories and in preserving these stories? I think right now we're in, this is repeated throughout history, right? But we're in a danger zone right now where things are being erased on a daily basis. And there are people out there that are doing digital archive work, and I know a lot of them, and sometimes I volunteer my time where they're going onto government websites and they're collecting all of the data before it disappears, scientific data, but also going into our national archives, which are having data disappeared really quietly. And so I think that there's an urgent need right now for making sure that we as individuals know that this stuff is happening, but also know that we have the power to save these things. And just right now, it just seems like it's community and collectivity and collectives that are the future in saving those things, not necessarily our institutions. And that I think is a big difference. There's another thing I want to say, but I would love for you to address anything you'd like to,
Well, I'm a very, despite my age, I'm a very old school type of person. One thing actually that there's also a lot of backlog on is actually knowing what's in a lot of archives that already exist. A lot of university archives in particular, they just get papers. People just donate their papers. And sometimes, if it's like a big name person, they'll go through it and they'll try to digitize it or they'll try to make it accessible. But there's a wealth of information that are housed in archives, particularly university archives, that no one really knows everything that's in there. There are very basic, minimal descriptions on the websites. And so if you do archival work, you kind of have to request the boxes that you get in advance. But sometimes it can kind of be a crapshoot because the descriptions are so scant that you don't always know what you're getting. And so I think thinking about it from maybe the older version of it is people going into archives and simply helping look through the collection of documents that already exist just to know what we have access to. If we don't know what we have access to, it's hard to do any type of speculative nonfiction or any type of reparative practice if we don't already know what exists, I would say.
That's amazing. And you just made me think of, maybe maybe the next thing to do is to reach out to my local cultural heritage organization and say, what do you have in the background that I can help you describe? What can I look through
I
with
thought the
you?
exact same word.
Yeah, that's so important. I'll stop there.
You can add your other thing, please. No, Liz, please don't give us your knowledge.
I want to talk about erasure so badly because it's something that I almost put in there. Because, a couple of things. One, erasure as accidental. This is a thing that I've been struggling with my entire career in digital humanities, right? So I almost put this in the presentation. 12, 13 years ago, repair was defined as recovery projects. So a lot of the work that I did when I first started as a professional in academia was taking these boutique web pages that had outdated code behind them that weren't going to work anymore. And a lot of them were recovery projects in and of themselves. So it was, documenting stories that had never been told from marginalized communities. And these were going to be erased off of the internet if we did not convert them to supported platforms. 12, 13 years later, they're broken again. And that's a type of accidental erasure that I think we now have strategies for in digital archives that we're trying to employ, but that I worry, the internet moves fast and everything is eventually going to break. So thinking of, the brokenness as leaving traces, right? As leaving things that are productive that we can see, and how do we make sure that the brokenness is beautiful, and all of those things are things that I think about when it comes to digital archives. And also, erasure is sometimes a good thing, because there are sometimes things in digital archives that communities do not want in those archives, and I've been thinking a lot about that as well. So sometimes we need to make sure that things like ceremonial objects from Indigenous communities are not available to the public because those communities do not want them available to the public. So sometimes it's a good thing. Thank you.
I will also comment that erasure can also mean a particular way of classifying entire groups of people, not simply just expunging them from the historical record, but only putting them or talking about them within a particular context. Reeves and Hartman talk a lot about this, and the commodification and objectification of Africans that were brought to the United States. And what that does is their subjectivity has been erased. And so what then gets preserved is this particular type of account that is rooted in repression, and that's the knowledge that gets passed. And so that's the knowledge that informs scholarship that comes decades, maybe centuries after it. And so that is in itself a type of erasure, because it is limiting the way in which we can engage with that time period.
Yeah, like personally as one surface instead of being more multifaceted. I'll just ask one more question, then I'll open up to everybody else. The other thing I thought about a lot while you were talking is the way archives, obviously archives and museums have really similar issues, but thinking about how many people's records or stories or things are housed, like you were talking about, like the records from the Iran war that are like housed in one place and they're not accessible, or from their most recent Iraq where they're not accessible to Iraqis, which is in some ways like literally stealing a country's past from them. And I guess maybe this is an issue I don't know anything about, but I'm curious, is there like an effort to like repatriate archives and the same with art museums? Is that also part of because it does seem, if you were trying to do your project as a person who had lived through the most current Iraq or in Iraq, the records you need would not even be in your country. Like it would not even be possible to like visit those archives locally in the way that you could go to Palo Alto and visit them or something because you're in America,
Yeah, no, those documents, they're not just, they were seized during the most recent Iraq war, but they encompass pretty much the entire history of the Ba'athist Party ruling Iran. So these are governmental documents going from back to the 80s, late 70s, both talking about the government and the rise of Saddam Hussein to Iraq. And yeah, those are all at Stanford. I think now they have a partnership with the Iraq Foundation. So there is a bit more. The documents aren't being sent back, but there's more of an effort to try to get Iraqi researchers access and to try to sift through all of use sort of figure out, especially since so in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s in both Iraq and also in Iran, there's a lot of propaganda going on, especially around the war, especially around chemical attacks on Kurdish populations. But these documents, especially the ones that are being given to like Saddam Hussein, they're obviously not propaganda. Right. They're much closer to what's actually going on, and it's hard to then kind of reconstruct that puzzle of your history if you don't have access to the pieces.
That was such a good answer.
Yeah.
Wow. I think that while you were talking, what it really made me think of is a lot of the things that I talk about with some of my archivist colleagues, right? In the traditional archival structure, the thing that I think wasn't asked as much, right, is who is this preservation for? Are we doing preservation for preservation's sake? Is this being preserved for the government? Is this being preserved for the people? What people, right? And I was just thinking about all of those questions that I am so excited I now hear archivists asking. And I think it is because of the very archives we work with that's happening. So just, that I can't add anything else.
Progress.
Yeah,
Progress.
there's progress, not everywhere, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you. And it is, I would say this, it's interesting as a preservation thing too, where it's safe to keep records, where to keep safe archives. And obviously we are proving ourselves in the last couple months to be not the stewards, maybe you can put those in this place, thought they were. If you have questions in the room or question line,
Yeah, so there are two question comments here. The first is that your very powerful ending line that you had was a little distorted because everyone went, ooh, yeah. And they wanted to know if you could repeat your final takeaway from your lecture.
Oh man. Yeah.
While you're doing that, I will ask the second one while you're pulling it up. And it's a question asking about, because there is so much left out of the archive, how do you even know where to look? How did you look? And how did you know the information was going to be there? Or was it more discovery? And do you have any sort of recommendations or resources for writers who aren't connected to academic institutions so that they can also kind of explore what's in the archive?
Yeah. Okay. So let me start with the last one, and then a lot of archives are open to members of the public. You can look. You usually have to make it an account through their whatever site that they're using, and then they will have repository information that you can search, and it will provide you, again, sometimes the details about what's actually in the box can be minimal or sometimes downright misleading. Not necessarily intentionally, but just because the archivists haven't had that much time to kind of go through everything. So a lot of archives are accessible to the public. They will have limitations. You will only be able to look at things in a reading room. You will only be able to access so many boxes in a day. But there are places where and this is unfortunate, but you do need a relationship with an academic institution in order to be able to be granted access, which is sad, right? Because researchers are not limited to academic institutions, but because of the sensitive nature or the rare nature of certain documents, you need sort of basically institutional credibility in order to be given access.
You should read it. You should read that quote. I want to hear it again so badly. I would love. Oh, if you can't find it, I'll answer. Okay. I'll go. Okay. No. I just want to read. I want to hear it so badly. So I wrote down a bunch of things, and I think first, a really kind email to an archivist is the thing to do. And I think also something that we've been talking about more in academia, and I know you know this, and I know most people in the room know this too, is that archivists are stewards of these materials, but they're also your fellow researchers. They
Mhm.
also want to know what are in these boxes, and they want to do it with you a lot of the time. So that email, that initial reach out, that is so important. But also, even though, you know, you might not, if you don't have an institutional affiliation, you might not get into the Yale, you know, archives, but you might be able to get into your local historical society archives. You might be able to connect with your state humanities council, who might be able to get you some affiliation so that you can get into an archive that you might not otherwise have access to. And believe me, state humanities councils right now are looking for ways that they can do work like this with folks that want to do research. So those are just some things that I was thinking while we were talking. Thank you.
What was the, I think there was a first part to the second question.
Yeah, the first part was so much is already missing from the archive and it's not cataloged, so how do you even, where do you even start if you don't know what's in your thing?
Email the archivist. Yeah. Email the archivist.
You do feel gaps as you research too, right?
Yeah.
You just eventually find the thing no one knows and that everyone's talking about, or documents that people reference that no one can find anymore, or, you know.
I think what we need is like an archive of archives, like like kind of a, because some places have them. I know like California, I think has, it's basically like, it's a website, it's sort of a giant index where you can search a particular topic and it will tell you who has what on it, or who has things that are close to it. I think that would be a good thing for the future. Well, after we finish preserving it, destroy
exactly.
and obliterate.
Yeah, and also expanding all the vocabulary so you'll be able to find things that are not just based on Library of Congress subject headings that don't give you any real information. Yeah.
Do you want to wow us with your ending again?
Please.
Oh, well, I only have like notes, but I think I said it is inevitable that yes, it is inevitable that you will meet failure and be faced with the impossible, but it is the pursuit that counts and an attempt to renegotiate our future, something like that.
That was another beautiful thing, even if it wasn't.
We do record.
This is recorded.
So we will go to the archive of this event, which exists in several days, and find out in the gap what you said in the applause. I'll recreate it together. Yes. Yeah, please. Liz, I'll let you call people so you can
Okay.
this. Okay.
Sarah.
So I want to come back to the idea that you brought up about individual people and us just archiving. Because I was just at a conference last week and was on a roundtable about podcast archiving, talking about archiving podcasting, how a lot of things are disappearing and how it was really weird. I'm the co-PI on the grant that with Liz on the grant that she was talking about. So we got the termination that morning, and then I was on the roundtable, so I was in a weird headspace. But I was talking about, I just started saying like we need guerrilla archiving, right? We just need to grab things now and figure it out later. That wasn't that well received. Yeah. But then you brought it up again. And so all of this preamble to ask, as people are grabbing things, as I know I'm doing it, I know lots of people are doing it, can we imagine what the after looks like? The day when what would it look like? What is the process? What is the reparative project to then regather all of this? Like what is, can we speculate as to how we might repair?
Yeah. So one thing that I thought of while you were talking, so guerrilla archives, but also I think what's going to be incredibly, I hope is not important and needed, but I think will be, are shadow archives. So places where we can make sure that the documents, the materials, the cultural heritage, the data, the stories are archived, but in a way that are not visible to folks that would destroy and erase them again. And that, I think, is the first step towards the future speculation, right? I think for me is if we can think about a world in which, or an internet in which, or an archive in which we can host it in a place or in several places or in several places on the internet or on the internet, but also on hard drives in a bunch of different spaces, right? Whether they be on universities or in my living room, right? But I provide access based on the community that I know, right?
Mhm.
I think that kind of community-based knowledge transfer is something that's going to become important, and I hope doesn't become important. And that's currently, maybe because everything feels so near right now, the thing that I am most imagining for the future, for access in the future. What a beautiful world it would be to think about what it is to regather.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I'm going to think about that maybe forever now, but also for the next like 30 seconds to see if I have an answer to it. Yeah,
I think you
thanks.
guys should write that novel. That's a really good novel about the regathering. It's called The Regathering.
There's like podcasts, entire podcasts
Yeah.
that were like talked a lot about the uprising in Ferguson.
Yeah.
And they're just gone, they're disappeared off the internet.
Yeah.
I have them, but so what?
Yeah.
Right? Like,
Mhm.
I have them, I will be a custodian of them, but what?
It makes me think about how many like shows that weren't on streaming we've seen back because other people before them put them on torrents and YouTube and things like that. Like a lot of old media I've only seen because someone had a random VHS tape of it, you know?
We are going to see such a resurgence of that kind of thing, like for sure. And the thing that I think always existed was the zine library, but now I think it's going to be like the zine library is the model for everything, right? Like someone in St. Louis has a room full of zines, and you go and you visit their room full of zines, and that's how zines are circulated. I've been there to that living room, and it's amazing, right? And I think we're going to see a lot more of that for these kind of cultural heritage material.
I mean, how many out of print books are in all of our libraries at home, right?
Yeah.
Books you've never heard anyone else talk about that you've loved for 15 years, and
Also, I mean, as long as one person has it, it's not gone. And I think for those of you at home, right now, I mean, the easiest thing to do is to try and get data that is trying to be completely destroyed.
Mhm.
And I think the government's sort of belief is that, in the age of information, if you don't have any data, if you haven't measured it, then it doesn't exist. And so they're erasing data on everything from climate change to child mortality. And keeping that data, even if in a couple of years it might be outdated, it provides a better foundation with which to address social maladies that the government would rather us forget.
One of the things I keep thinking about when you guys are talking about this is the large language models that were trained by just crawling like the entire internet. And I keep wondering, is that like they just do it and not, you know what I mean? But like presumably at one point they had everything. And I'm like, when OpenAI goes bankrupt in 3 years, we can buy their archive for the transfer thing. I should forget.
That's the real future.
Yeah.
We'll all our money to buy that done,
Yeah.
and then we spend years and decades coming through it. That's how we regather.
Right.
Okay, we got it. Great.
Although, I mean, I think knowing or OpenAI, they'll just destroy it.
They didn't keep it. It wasn't
fine.
something they kept. Yeah.
You're so right.
I know.
Yeah.
But they're not the only ones.
Nope.
That are being.
Yeah.
All of these AI companies.
Mhm.
Are all AI
There were a lot of books I read when I was, in the late 90s, early 2000s. You had pre-ebook that like brought a print, and you would get like a photocopied copy of like David Oley's Motorman or something. It would just blow your mind. There was no way to buy one, like zero. It was just being passed hand to hand. maybe we'll do a little more photocopying for each other. Maybe we'll share some things a little differently. It would be the worst. I mean, it's all the worst, but like that, I kind of miss people handing you a photocopy of a book, you know? Yeah.
Hey, you're a rebel.
Yeah, see? I'm right.
Yeah.
Okay, maybe for one more question, if someone has one.
I just wanted to ask for Imad, what could, because your research in the Iranian martyrs is very interesting to me. What is one of the interesting points of research that you've uncovered that you feel like is kind of just unknown? Like you were just kind of like very shocked to read about when you got to visit those archives.
Oh wow, that's a really good question. So many of them are just like brutal, details. Yeah, I mean, the one that I was very shocked by, because I knew that there was some of it involved, and this was in the essay yesterday, but it's estimated that the different estimations on exactly how many martyrs or besieged there were on the Iranian side, but some say it's around 150,000, and out of that 150,000, a third of them were between the ages of 12 and 17, which would make them child soldiers. And that was very surprising. And then not all of them died, and some of them became POWs. And looking through the Bacchus records at Stanford, talking about capturing 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, and not being exactly sure they put them in the same POW camp. That was, I think, probably the most shocking part. I think that gets overshadowed. That kind of really horrible aspect of the work gets kind of overshadowed by all of the chemical warfare that happened. But it's, of course, tragic.
Well, thank you.
Ron, do you have a question?
Just real quickly, I was interested in a lot of what we're talking about is what we're going to for and others call it the immutable mobile. That is something that is stationary but can move around. That paper archives, digital archives, mobile, but they're singular documents. But as Liz was mentioning, there are, and historically over time before printing presses and before a lot of writing, there are other ways of carrying on stories and remembering them. And so I'm just gesturing to this might be a time and place where we think about carrying memory in different ways.
Thank you, Ron. As always, your questions are always how beautiful. Carrying memory in different ways. I wrote that down. I'll answer just hopefully very quickly. One of the things that we've been thinking about in the Digital Record Archives Working Group, and also just in various conversations I've had with archivists too, is there's this amazing book called No Archive Will Restore You. That's half memoir, half theory. It's written by Julietta Singh. And in it, she talks about the body archive and the knowledge that we carry within our bodies. And that's, some of that is ancestral thinking, but a lot of it is actually the traumas that we hold in our bodies and what that tells us about the things that are going on outside in the world and how we carry it and we pass it down. And I've been thinking a lot about that, especially right now. And I think, in the past I've thought about it a lot too, but just it feels especially important right now to think about the things that we carry in our bodies. And, even as you were talking, I was thinking about the ways that we even carry our experiences with archives in our bodies too. Because I think I've been in archives before where I'm sifting through, I think at some point I did in one day 500 death certificates, right? And looking at that much death in a day and the way that you're carrying that experience in your body, it's like you're carrying the history of that death in your body. You're like re-grieving. So thank you, Ron, as always.
That was great. Now I have nothing to add. That was awesome.
Sorry.
Thank you both so much. It's really fantastic, and I can feel I just want to go act and do and move and restore and prepare and preserve, and I'm sure that's true of everybody here. Thank you guys so much for your talks. Really appreciate both. And thanks so much to everybody who's being here. 2 weeks is our last event of the semester, which will be our annual World Building Student Showcase. Several of the people who are speaking were here tonight. We'll be speaking there. So we'll come back and we'll switch everybody around. They can be up there, you can be over here, and it'll be great. Thank you, everyone.